What happens when past misunderstandings collide with unexpected kindness? In this touching story, Mrs. Tuan silently battles an illness, hiding her suffering from everyone, until Ly Tu Diem accidentally discovers the truth. Despite being scorned and rejected by Mrs. Tuan in the past, Diem shows genuine care and concern, preparing meals, offering comfort, and patiently attending to her needs. Slowly, Mrs. Tuan's heart softens, and she begins to see Diem in a new light, trusting, respecting, and quietly accepting her without ever speaking a word. Don't miss this emotional journey of forgiveness, compassion, and human connection. Subscribe now to follow the full story. Mrs. Tuan had always been a woman of quiet pride and unyielding strength, the kind of person who carried her burdens silently, never allowing anyone to see the cracks beneath the surface. For weeks, perhaps months, she had been battling an illness she refused to acknowledge, even to herself. She feared appearing weak in front of her family, afraid that her suffering might disrupt the delicate balance of their lives, or, worse, become a source of worry for her son, Tuan, whose work already demanded so much of him. So she endured the fatigue, the fleeting pains, and the moments of dizziness in silence, keeping her condition hidden behind carefully composed smiles and the ritual of daily routines. But fate, as it often does, has a way of revealing truths when least expected. One quiet afternoon, Du Diem happened to be in the house, attending to errands and offering help in ways that had once been unwelcome. Her presence had always been a source of tension. Mrs. Tuan had, in the past, reacted with sharp words and pointed disapproval whenever Diem tried to engage with the family. She remembered those confrontations vividly, the way she had once expelled Diem from the house, scolding her with words that cut deeper than she intended, only to feel a pang of guilt later. Yet today, there was something different in the air, something that demanded attention. It began with the subtle observations that only someone truly caring would notice. Diem, while folding laundry in the corner of the living room, paused mid-task, her eyes narrowing slightly as she caught sight of Mrs. Tuan's pale complexion, the way her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the teacup, and the faint dark circles shadowing her eyes. Diem's heart tightened at the sight. She had seen strong women falter before, but there was a fragility here that could not be ignored. Without a word, she approached, gently asking if Mrs. Tuan had been feeling well, if she had eaten properly, and if perhaps she might rest for a while. At first, Mrs. Tuan's instinct was to dismiss the concern, to brush it off as unnecessary fuss. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice steady but lacking its usual firmness. There was a flicker of pride in her gaze, an invisible shield she had perfected over years of maintaining control over her household. Yet Diem's presence, calm and unwavering, seemed to pierce that shield with ease. There was no reproach in her tone, no trace of the bitterness that might have provoked anger or resentment. Instead, there was only gentle insistence, the kind born from genuine concern and empathy. And in that insistence, Mrs. Tuan found herself taken aback. She had expected to feel irritation, to sharpen her words and defend her privacy. But instead, there was an unexpected warmth stirring within her chest, a recognition of something she had not been ready to admit. Diem's care was sincere. Despite all the past misunderstandings, the moments of tension and scorn, Diem had come forward not out of obligation, not because of fear or duty, but because of an authentic desire to help. Mrs. Tuan felt a strange mix of emotions: surprise, caution, and, slowly, a reluctant admiration for the young woman who had stepped into her world so effortlessly, so kindly. For the first time in a long while, Mrs. Tuan allowed herself to notice not just the illness she had been hiding, but the human connection that had reached across the barriers she had so firmly erected. Yim, once merely an intruder in her carefully ordered life, now became a silent observer of her vulnerabilities, and for reasons she could not fully articulate, that observation did not feel invasive. Instead, it felt necessary. Even as pride urged her to retreat, a quieter, more profound part of her mind began to acknowledge the possibility of trust, of acceptance, and perhaps, in time, of forgiveness. Ziem's concern did not stop at mere observations. She acted on them with a patience and tenderness that seemed to disarm Mrs. Tuan entirely. She prepared small meals, careful to include the foods that were gentle on the stomach yet nourishing, and placed them where Mrs. Tuan could easily reach them. She reminded her to drink water, to rest, and even suggested gentle stretches to ease the stiffness that had begun to creep into her joints. Each action was measured, deliberate, and offered with a soft-spoken kindness that made it impossible for Mrs. Tuan to respond with irritation as she once would have. At first, Mrs. Tuan's pride resisted the gestures. She was accustomed to being the one who cared for others, who made decisions and gave orders. To accept help, especially from Ziem, a woman she had once judged so harshly, felt almost unnatural. Yet every time she attempted to decline, Ziem's patient smile and unwavering presence melted the resistance like sunlight on frost. There was no judgment in Ziem's eyes, no whisper of the old grievances. Only concern, genuine and unselfish. Mrs. Tuan found herself listening to her, following small pieces of advice, and slowly allowing herself to be cared for. As the days passed, the atmosphere in the house shifted in subtle but undeniable ways. Where tension had once lingered like a heavy fog, there was now warmth, a quiet intimacy that had nothing to do with obligation or duty. Ziem would sit with Mrs. Tuan in the afternoons, asking gentle questions about her comfort, her memories, and her days. And though Mrs. Tuan had initially answered with short, guarded responses, she began to find herself speaking more freely. She talked about the garden she once tended, the meals she had cooked for her family, the times when Tuan was a child and she worried about him endlessly. Ziem listened, nodding, encouraging, and laughing softly at the right moments, as if to remind Mrs. Tuan that her life and experiences were valued, that they mattered to someone beyond her own family. The change was not immediate. It was a slow awakening. Mrs. Tuan felt something she had long buried, an acknowledgement of her own vulnerability, and, paradoxically, a growing respect for the young woman who had refused to be intimidated by the shadows of the past. Ziem's care was not performative, nor was it motivated by any desire to gain approval. It was simply a quiet, unwavering commitment to kindness. And with each passing day, Mrs. Tuan's defenses, once ironclad, softened imperceptibly. She began to notice the patience in Ziem's eyes, the gentle attentiveness in her hands, the way she anticipated needs without being asked. It was in those small, almost imperceptible actions that Mrs. Tuan began to see Ziem not as the girl she had once scorned, but as someone worthy of trust and appreciation. There was a sincerity that could not be fabricated, a warmth that could not be ignored. Even as her pride told her to remain distant, to keep Ziem at arm's length, another part of her, the part that had longed for understanding and gentleness in her own life, began to lean toward acceptance. In her heart, she realized that Ziem's kindness was not a challenge to her authority, nor a threat to her position within the family. It was a gift, offered freely. And in that realization, Mrs. Tuan felt an unfamiliar but deeply comforting sense of gratitude. By the end of the week, Mrs. Tuan noticed that she was no longer resisting the small attentions, no longer brushing off the gentle words or soft gestures. She began to anticipate Ziem's presence with a subtle warmth in her chest, a quiet relief that someone was truly looking out for her. And though she would never say it aloud, never voice the admission of changing feelings, the truth was there in the way she looked at Ziem, in the way her shoulders relaxed in her presence, in the small smile that now sometimes found its way to her lips when Ziem was near. For the first time in a long while, Mrs. Tuan allowed herself to experience the simple comfort of being cared for. And in doing so, her perception of Ziem shifted profoundly, quietly laying the foundation for a bond that neither had expected, yet both would come to cherish. Over time, the subtle care and unwavering patience that Jim offered began to weave an unspoken thread of connection between them. Mrs. Toan, who had once regarded Jim with suspicion, resentment, and even scorn, now found herself observing the young woman with a quiet, contemplative admiration. Every gentle gesture, every patient word, every small act of attentiveness began to reshape the image of Jem in her mind. The sharp edges of past grievances softened, replaced by a growing awareness that Jim's presence was not only harmless, but comforting. It was as if a window had opened in Mrs. Toan's heart, letting in a warmth she hadn't realized she'd been missing all these years. Mrs. Toan's acceptance, however, was silent and deliberate. She did not speak of it aloud, nor did she offer verbal approval or praise. Her pride, honed over decades, would not allow her to openly admit to the change of heart. Yet, in the smallest details, Jim could sense the shift. There were fewer abrupt gestures of dismissal, a softening in the tone of her voice, a lingering glance when Jim entered the room. Even when Mrs. Toan remained reserved, these subtle acknowledgments communicated far more than words ever could. Jim, ever perceptive, understood that she had begun to occupy a different place in Mrs. Toan's life, a space once closed off, now cautiously opened. One afternoon, as Jim carefully adjusted a blanket over Mrs. Toan while she rested in her favorite armchair, Mrs. Toan allowed herself to relax completely for the first time in weeks. The tension that had always coiled in her shoulders and neck seemed to ease, replaced by an unfamiliar sense of security. She watched Jim's gentle hands, the concentration in her eyes, the soft, soothing way she spoke, and felt a deep, quiet gratitude swelling inside her. It was a feeling so profound and unexpected that it nearly brought tears to her eyes, though she would never allow them to fall in front of anyone. Instead, she simply inhaled slowly, savoring the moment, and allowed herself to appreciate the selflessness and kindness that Jim had brought into her life. In the following days, their interactions continued to evolve. Mrs. Toan began to anticipate Jim's gestures, even take comfort in them. When Jim arrived with a cup of tea, she no longer waved her away. When Jim offered assistance with small household tasks, she no longer refused outright. A silent trust had formed, delicate, yet unbreakable. Mrs. Tuan understood that Jim's care was not a fleeting courtesy, but a genuine commitment to her well-being. And in that understanding, she began to reconcile with the past, not forgetting the moments of tension or hurt, but acknowledging that those events were no longer the defining measure of who Jim was. This quiet acceptance transformed Mrs. Tuan's perception not only of Jim, but also of herself.
She realized that vulnerability did not diminish her strength and that accepting help did not equate to weakness. In embracing Jim's kindness, she discovered a new form of dignity, one that allowed her to receive love and compassion without fear or hesitation. And though she never voiced her thoughts aloud, the change was evident in the subtle ways she engaged with Jim: a nod of approval, a softened gaze, a lingering posture when they shared a room. By the time Jim left the house each day, Mrs. Toan would find herself reflecting on the transformation that had quietly taken place. She could no longer deny that Jim had become someone she respected deeply, someone whose presence brought calm and warmth into her life. The resentment and scorn that had once defined their interactions had been replaced by a profound, unspoken bond. In her heart, Mrs. Tawan silently accepted Jim, not as the girl she had once judged harshly, but as a trusted companion whose kindness and sincerity had quietly broken through walls that pride and fear had built over the years. And in that silent acceptance, there was a quiet joy, a reassurance that even the most guarded hearts could find a way to open when met with genuine care.
Hello, xin chào tất cả các khán giả của kênh Lý Tử Diệm Review. Vậy là sau rất nhiều gian khổ và với sự chăm sóc tận tình của Lý Tử Diễm dành cho mẹ của Toàn, bà mẹ của Toàn đã âm thầm có cái nghĩ khác về Lý Tử Diễm và bà đã ngầm chấp nhận Lý Tử Diễm đến với Toàn và để cho Diễm với Toàn yêu nhau tự do mà không nói ra, mà chỉ là âm thầm chấp nhận mà thôi. Đó có phải là một khởi đầu tốt đẹp cho Diễm và Toàn hay không? Khi tình yêu của họ bây giờ được công khai đến với nhau, hay vì sao họ còn những trăn trở nào? Tất cả sẽ được hé lộ vào các tập tiếp theo, sẽ được phát sóng hàng ngày trên kênh. Các bạn hãy đón xem nhé. Xin chào và hẹn gặp lại các bạn. Bye bye!